Am I on? Am I doing it? Well, okay. So today's lecture is on American imperialism. We can call it expansion or manifest destiny sort of 2.0, as well as progressivism. And on paper, they appear to be sort of oddly joined together. What happens at the end of the 1800s and what happens at the beginning of the 1900s. And the first part feels bad almost, like we're going around and we're exploiting people. And the second part feels good, like somehow we're saving people. But there's actually a commonality or continuity to this. It's a belief that as America, we can improve. First, it's the world. We can help our little brown brothers and sisters, as McKinley said, in the Philippines. And then we can also help all sorts of type of people domestically, be they in cities, be they in factories. So I want you to see some continuity between the two. But we want to figure out why is it that we go around the world? Because we've been content up until this point going from sea to shining sea with our manifest destiny of the 1830s into the 40s and then into the 50s. So why are we expanding? First and foremost, we now have stuff to trade. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, which we get much later than Europe, we now have stuff to trade. And as a result of the Industrial Revolution, we also need raw materials. And we've basically run out of raw materials, or we haven't figured out how to fully exploit the raw materials on our continent that we later will be able to do. I want you to think of the name Alfred Beveridge. And that's a name that perhaps doesn't get emphasized enough in Tyndall. And this is a senator from Indiana who more than anybody else says, think of China's illimitable markets. Think of this as a stepping stone, namely the Philippines, to China. Obviously, we have been engaged in China going all the way back to the Treaty of Wanghia, which, of course, you guys probably never heard of, okay? But the idea here is that China is that jewel. Now, another name that you want to remember is Alfred Thayer Mahan. I'm sorry, it's Albert Beveridge, Alfred Thayer Mahan. This is the man who says, if we're going to be a great power, and in fact, he was a student of naval power, we need a few ingredients. We need a two-ocean navy. We need coaling stations for our ships. We need colonies, and we need an Isthmian canal. He is painting a picture that will come to fruition in many ways. And he's saying, if we want to be a big dog, we have to follow this recipe. In addition, you've got nationalism. We are now, if you think about it, over 100 years old. We're ready to sort of pound our chests. We're ready to show the world that we can do what they are doing. Okay? Catching up with Britain, catching up with Spain, catching up with the Netherlands, catching up with Portugal, as they have imperialized throughout Africa, obviously Latin America, and then into Asia. Now, social Darwinism, this idea that somehow we are predestined to sort of carry this white man's burden. Okay, there are certain people that are made to be great, and certain people that are made to be inferior, and we're made to be great, and other countries are made to be inferior, and we can help lift them up. That goes along with this Christian missionary idea, particularly a messianic idea that the end of the world is nigh, and we want to make sure that we save everybody before the Savior comes. All of this sort of comes together in terms of ideology, but this is something that we fear, the closing of the West. The West has always been our Eden, the place that we can go, that safety valve, that if everything gets bad in the city, we can keep going west. We've been doing that since 1607 in Jamestown. Well, we hear from the census in 1890, the same year of the Battle of Wounded Knee, if you're keeping track, that it's closed and it's done. And then Frederick Jackson Turner, a history professor at Wisconsin, says, that's bad. Because again, the West has been a democratizing influence, so we need a new West. So let us go even further. And then if you think about all the events of the Gilded Age, from labor strikes, we've got Homestead, we've got Pullman, we've got Haymarket, we've got the Great Railroad Strike, we have the Indian Wars, all of that, Treaty of Fort Laramie, the Bozeman Massacre, the Little Bighorn, Wounded Knee, we've got all of that. We've got populism, the whole free silver idea of farmers fighting against industrialism. And then obviously everything that we've seen post-Reconstruction or during Reconstruction, then post-Reconstruction, all of that is leading to let's get out and blow off steam. Who's the man more than anyone else that says this will help us to have a fight against someone else who will get rid of all of the fighting that we're doing here in America? He had big teeth, squinty eyes. TR, okay? Teddy Roosevelt, more than anyone, is the sort of proponent of doing this, going out and beating up on somebody. It's certainly what Il Duce Mussolini will do to Ethiopians at the beginning of World War II, okay? So, Hawaii is the first place we go. Hawaii, frankly speaking, is not that important in terms of resources, but it's a good coaling station, because if you've ever been to Hawaii, it's about halfway to Asia. In addition, it has sugar, and it has people that we want to convert. So we've got sugar interest there, and we've got godly interest there. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, at least to the Hawaiians, and by Hawaiians I mean the rich white people that have gone to Hawaii to tell the Hawaiians what to do and how to grow sugar, they find out that the McKinley tariff is going to reduce their really, really sweet, no pun intended, deal that they have with tariffs in the United States. So all of a sudden, they were sending sugar really, really cheap to the United States, and then all of a sudden the McKinley tariff jacks it up. So they're really upset. At the same time, essentially, Queen Liliuokalani takes over and says, wait a sec, these white people, and if you know Hawaiian, it's haole, these haole are taking over our island. So she rises up in a nationalistic way. These sugar barons are aggrieved, and what happens is, with a little bit of wink-wink from the United States, without the president's support, the Marines come in and help take out Queen Liliuokalani. So now you have that age-old question that we saw in Texas, which is, hey, we'd like to be annexed. Please, annex us. Because in this particular case, being annexed gets them that sweet deal with sugar again. What happens is Grover Cleveland says, no, I smell something fishy. This doesn't work. The Hawaiians don't seem to be on board, so he rejects annexation. It will only later be under McKinley, as we are dealing with the Philippines, that we quickly snatch up Hawaii. Okay? So Hawaii is the first place that we're interested in, but don't actually take it until we get involved with the Spanish-American War. And if you know anything about Hawaii, it has nothing to do with the Spanish-American War. It just happens to be there, and we're going to the Philippines, so it seems like a nice piece to pick up. Okay? But let's go to Cuba, which is much, much closer than Hawaii. It is an island only 90 miles away, and at some point these slides may get slightly out of order because I'll rethought them, but I think you guys will adjust because you're smart kids. Okay? So, Spain has been in Cuba since Columbus, okay? So we're dealing with the late 1400s. Now I want you to go ahead essentially 400 years to the late 1800s, and the Spanish are now like a 10th-rate empire, all right? They really have nothing to recommend themselves, but they're still hanging on to Cuba. And they're treating the Cubans very, very poorly, and the Cubans are rising up, and then the Spanish are oppressing them, and you know that they're oppressing them if the guy's name is the Butcher, okay? So it's Butcher Weiler, and he uses these tactics that are essentially called concentration camps to take the rebels, put them all together so that they are not influencing the civilians. Now, we get images in America of these awful, emaciated, dying Cubans. And along with this idea of yellow journalism from Hearst and Pulitzer, who are sending out these sensational, lurid stories of just how bad the Spanish are, we want to get in. And we say, look at them, they're revolutionaries just like us. But please note, the Cubans and the Spanish were beating each other up. It wasn't like the Cubans were total victims, but that's the way we wanted to see it, okay? In addition, the Spanish write a terrible, terrible letter called the De Lume letter, where they compare our president to basically a chocolate eclair. In essence, he has no backbone, and he is weak, and he is led by all of his followers. Or the funny thing is that Teddy Roosevelt said the same thing about McKinley, and he was later included as a vice president. So again, we took great umbrage at this, combined with this idea of the USS Maine. Now, the USS Maine is in Havana. It sits in the port of Havana. It's ready to evacuate Americans because we have major interest there. And then all of a sudden it blows up, and who must have blown it up? Of course the Spanish blew it up because it must have been a mine in the port of Havana, but we did it because we just didn't really know what we were doing, okay? But it doesn't matter because we're not going to really figure that out until about 80 years later. So again, to the hell with Spain, remember the Maine. In some ways, it's that same idea that gets us going if we're going to take ourselves back to trying to get ourselves shot in the Mexican-American War, right there between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, or even sort of remember the Alamo. These are fighting words. So we go to war. But we say from the beginning, guys, we are not going to take Cuba. So we promise from the beginning. The Teller Amendment says we have no designs on Cuba. This is our generosity. This is not our selfishness. Okay? So we find ourselves in war, and Teddy Roosevelt, who's an undersecretary of the Navy, says, we're fighting Spain, and obviously we're going to do it in Cuba, but they have a far-flung empire, and they still have the Philippines, and I want the Philippines because it's close to China, so I'm going to use this opportunity to send George Dewey to Manila. Now, this was a piece of cake. We stormed into Manila. We beat the Spanish really, really easily because the Spanish are that easy to beat, but then we're stuck. All we have is ships. You cannot go onto land on a ship unless it's one of those duck boats that you see in Boston or Philadelphia. Okay, so we didn't have duck boats. Dewey comes in, he's like, I got a duck boat. I'm really great. Okay, so he can't do it. So he sits in Manila and he waits for months until we can actually take the land, and we bring back a rebel, Emilio Aguinaldo. And Emilio Aguinaldo is going to show up on the scene later on because he is trying to fight off the Spanish himself, and then he thinks that we are going to help him fight off the Spanish to give the Philippines back to the Filipinos, but we don't, because we did, oh my God, look at them, they need so much help. Okay, and so we stay there and fight Emilio Aguinaldo for 3 years, and he's saying, I don't understand why you're not giving this up. Okay, so Emilio Aguinaldo's back on the scene, and we're going to take the Philippines, and it's actually not that hard. Cuba's not that hard either. We actually make it harder on ourselves because we've got aging Civil War vets, we've got terrible, terrible attire to fight in Cuba, we've got spoiled meat, but the one man who emerges is Teddy Roosevelt, who emerges only because he wrote about himself emerging, okay? Teddy Roosevelt didn't do anything all that remarkable, except he was a phenomenal propagandist about himself. So Teddy Roosevelt emerges from the Battle of San Juan Hill, which isn't really at San Juan Hill, but again, Bunker Hill wasn't at Bunker Hill, so who cares, okay? But we beat the Spanish. More people die from disease and spoiled meat than anything else, so we've won, okay? We took the Philippines, we took Cuba. We call it a splendid little war. This war took only a few months, and we pound our chest. We just beat the Spanish. But someone needed to say, the Spanish were the last tough like 100 years ago. But we don't care, because we don't have that many wins in our history, so we'll take a win over the sad Spanish, okay? So what do we get? Okay, we get Cuba, which we said we weren't going to take anyway with the Teller Amendment. We get Puerto Rico and Guam, neither of which is all that great, but we get the Philippines. Now the question is, what are you going to do with the Philippines? We bought it, but we've got to decide, are we going to relinquish it, or are we going to keep it? Now, this is the real question, and this is where we find ourselves in somewhat of a moral quandary. People say, you know what? Again, American exceptionalism. We want to show everybody just how great we are, and we can help uplift these poor Filipinos. Plus, it puts us on the doorstep of China. And think about it. If someone else got it, that would put them on the doorstep of China. So McKinley prayed on it, okay? He prayed on it, he said, I think I'm going to do it. Because again, this vision was, he's got to help the, in his words, the most racist words you're going to read, my brown little brothers and sisters need us. But the Anti-Imperialist League, led by people like a Samuel Gompers of the AFL and Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, depending on where you're from, a Jane Addams, sort of a motley crew of people come together and say, no, this doesn't work. Okay, remember our own revolution. We wanted our own self-government, and that would be denying them. In addition, you know what? We are not actually the shining example that we say we are. Look at the United States right now. So why would we want to export our racism? Okay? And then people like Gomper say, well, if we take the Philippines, Filipinos will come here and Filipinos will work for cheap. Please remember the whole idea of the Irish or the Chinese, why people were so upset for them working for lower wages. Now, one of these ideas over here that I failed to put in is this idea, of course, of the white man's burden, that we should and can do it. And look, we're really good. We subjugated our own Indians very, very well, okay? We took out our own natives, so we know how to do it. Again, we thought very highly of ourselves in this particular regard, and at the end of the day, we do annex the Philippines. And not surprisingly, the Filipinos who thought we were liberating them, but weren't liberating them, were quite upset and waged a guerrilla war. And I just want to keep you guys tuned in to what's going on. We're not really good at guerrilla warfare. So I want you to go from the early 1900s to, say, 60 years later, where we're fighting another Asian group of guerrillas who don't want us there, i.e. the Viet Cong, okay? And we get no better at doing it after 60 years, okay? So we're not really good at fighting far away from home against people that don't want us there for something that, frankly, we don't even know why we're doing it necessarily, okay? It will be in 1946, right after World War II, that we finally grant the Filipinos their independence. But there is an argument amongst many Filipinos that we did provide an infrastructure, health and education, so it wasn't all bad, but frankly, they would have rather been independent overall. Okay? So we've acquired Hawaii, we've picked up the Philippines, we've taken Cuba, sort of, we've got Guam, and we've got Puerto Rico. But the important part about, again, the Philippines is it puts us on the doorstep, pun intended here, for China. Now, you got to remember, we're late to the game. Everybody else has carved up China in what they call spheres of influence, which means they control the economic the conditions and sort of policies in different areas within China. So we, as the United States is really good at doing, make a pronouncement. It's called the open door note, where we say, that's not fair for you to carve up China